All right, welcome CST 229. This is Professor Bachner, and this is going to be, as quick as possible, a tutorial on the cultural artifact speech and the cultural resume. Both assignments are worth similar points, and both assignments will have the same due date. So I know many of you guys are audio learners or visual learners, and I know that because of the nature of the course, time goes by so quickly, and I often don't have time to describe all your assignments in detail. So I'm hoping that this tutorial will better explain the resume and the artifact speech. And of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or arrange some type of appointment after the instruction if you still have questions. Okay. So, as I mentioned before, in CST 229, you don't necessarily have many quizzes or exams, but you do have a handful of assignments that are equivalent to a midterm or a final exam grade. So, the cultural resume and the cultural artifact speech would be equivalent to a midterm grade, and it is due around the time halfway through the semester. So, let me talk about the cultural resume first. Now, if you have experience with a work resume, you'll find the assignment very similar. If you've created a work resume before, you know that work resumes are very brief and they highlight your work experience. So this is very similar to the cultural resume. In the cultural resume, you're going to highlight your cultural experience, your cultural values, and try to summarize them in a very concise few points in a couple pages. I will say a few things with the cultural resume is that many students often get confused or don't understand if they're multicultural, or they don't think many of their values coincide with one specific culture. I would say approach this assignment and fill out this assignment based on your family unit. And what things, activities, holidays, languages do you use in your family unit? And the cultural values will naturally, subconsciously emerge from that content. Okay, so let's talk about the cultural resume. A cultural resume is a document that summarizes one's experience identifying with a certain culture. The resume provides insight into a culture's customs, traditions, values, and norms of behavior. The purpose of this assignment is to create a 1 to 2 page resume that adds to cultural understanding and gives others insights into your culture for 25 points. So let's talk a little bit more about the guidelines. First, you want to research your culture to find rich material to present. Ask questions about the history and traditions of your culture to an elder family member is a very good starting point. Next, you want to include an introduction paragraph. The introduction paragraph tells the reader your intentions and contains a brief history of your culture. Thirdly, resume must include the following headings and subpoints. Use the major headings given, then simply, directly, and tightly summarize your information. So subheading 1, traditions. And under traditions, you should have events, holidays, religion, dating, marriage. Now, I would say that probably your culture celebrates more than one holiday, and to summarize all the holidays your culture celebrates is a paper in itself. So I would say for all of these different sub points, just pick 1 or 2 examples. So holidays, you might want to pick a quinceañera and Christmas. You don't necessarily have to label all of the holidays you celebrate, but just 1 or 2 that are very significant. Next, number 2, lifestyles: work, education, art, music, and food. 6, or number 3, the 6 Hofstede values. We've talked about this in class and most likely a discussion board. So just make sure you refer to your textbook and class notes. But reminder, Hofstede's includes the different dimensions, including individualism to collectivism to masculinity, femininity, and so forth. And number 4, communication style. So language, idioms, nonverbal behaviors, and conflict resolution style. So those are the main headings and subheadings that your resume should follow. Finally, you want to have a concluding paragraph. A concluding paragraph is required for you to summarize how belonging to your culture has shaped your identity. For instance, now that you have disclosed your cultural traditions, lifestyle, values, etc., how these variables add to the person you have become. So this is just reflective of your cultural identity and the appreciation of your culture. Make sure that you also do edit your resume for grammar, punctuation, spelling, and formatting. I find that in most cultural resumes, this is where people lose points. Not necessarily the content, because it's your culture. I'm not going to tell you what, your culture is or isn't, because that's your identity. But I will correct to make sure that, it's punctual, it's professional, that it's an appropriate document. And then finally, submit your typed single-spaced cultural resume to Canvas, okay? Sometimes I like to learn best by example. So let me pick an example. Let me show you really quickly an example of an outstanding cultural resume. This was done by a past student of mine named Chloe, and she talked about the Filipino culture. So as you see in Chloe's example, she has a brief paragraph summarizing her Filipino culture. She talks a little bit about the Spanish and other cultural influences. Then she highlights the traditions. So here she talked about some events, holidays, religion, dating, and marriage. And as you see, every section is pretty concise. It's just a couple sentences. I really liked how she picked out specific holidays that were unique to her. Then she talks about the lifestyle of her Filipino heritage. She talked about work, education, art and music, and food. You could never go wrong with food. Chloe also talked about the 6 Hofstede cultural values. So she talked about power distance, individualism, and other components of Hofstede in her cultural resume. She also talked about language. So some examples of language. And finally, Chloe ended her cultural resume with just kind of a nice little reflection about what her culture is to her. And Chloe got a perfect score. So if you review Chloe's example, this is a really good example to follow with your cultural resume. One other thing I would just kind of recommend too is that there's no specific format for the cultural resume. I'm more concerned with the content. So if you have experience once again with work resumes, you know that they're all kind of a little bit different in style. So that's okay. Just make sure that your document looks nice, neat, and is consistent. Okay, but if your heading is a little bit different, or your spacing is a little bit different, or you use numbers instead of bullet points, that's perfectly fine for the resume. I'm more concerned about the content. Okay, so we discussed the cultural resume, and then I gave you guys an example of an outstanding cultural resume. The next assignment I want to talk about is the cultural artifact speech. Now, let me make this a little bit larger, but, oh no, we don't want to use Grammarly right now. But I will say that, if you're viewing this video, you should have already printed out these documents to kind of help you out. All right, what is wrong with my Zoom? So I like to call the cultural artifact speech a show and tell speech. So if you remember back in 5th grade, you read a book and you got to the front of the class and told the class what the book is about, right? So this is a glorified show and tell speech. So the general purpose of this speech is for you to prepare and deliver a speech to address to the audience that introduces an artifact that introduces your culture. Only one artifact is to be discussed. Examples in ethnic dress, a book, a food, an object, etc. Focus on why the artifact is important to you and how it represents your culture. Your artifact must be clearly shown at some point during the speech. Okay, so what exactly is an artifact? I would say that we have probably discussed this in class by now. If not, review the chapter on the section of an artifact, but the artifact is basically any object that represents the culture. Also, for this purpose of the assignment, I broaden the definition of an artifact. So for example, if you don't necessarily have to have the exact object, but you could show a photograph of the object. For example, I had a student that was from Brazil and wanted to give her speech on Carnival. Obviously, Carnival is not a big object itself, but she showed a photograph of the floats and the dresses and the parade, and that counted as a visual aid. Other cultural artifacts you can think of are actual objects, food items, different traditions, and kind of celebrations. Those are examples of artifacts. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily need to be a physical object, but I'm sure you could find an artifact in your home that represents one piece of identity of your culture. Okay, so what are the components of this speech? First, you need to have an introduction. Next, you need to have a body of a speech. Third, you need to have an effective conclusion. Okay, the speech should be at least 3 to 5 minutes, so try to aim for 4 minutes. The speech should be recorded, and I will provide you instructions if you're going to give this in class or if you're going to upload this to Canvas or to a discussion board. Okay, but yes, the speech does need to be recorded. Because this is not a public speaking class, I'm not too concerned about the usage of note cards, or I'm not going to necessarily strictly grade you on your delivery skills, but you do want to practice your speech a little bit. Okay, now some of you guys are probably thinking, how am I going to talk about 4 minutes about my Bible, or 4 minutes about this bowl, or 4 minutes about this photograph? Here in the rubric, I provide you an example organizational pattern of the cultural artifact speech. You don't have to use it, but I highly suggest you do because it has a nice introduction, a solid body, and a conclusion. And it also has some tips or pointers that you could elaborate with your artifact. So in the first part of your speech, you want to give a quick introduction, not a very long, a very quick introduction. Start with an intention getter, so maybe it's a brief story about your culture or your cultural artifact. Provide a thesis statement, which is basically one sentence telling us what your speech is about. Provide some reasons to listen. So from a public speaking perspective, audiences are very egotistical. So, tell them that this is, if you're talking about Carnival, tell them how popular it is, how many tourists flock to Carnival, how it is an economic necessity, how it's just, self-awareness. It's interesting to learn about different cultural events. And then D is provide an overview. And an overview is simply a summation of what your body is going to consist of. What are the main points you're going to talk about? So an example overview might be, today I'm going to talk to you about Carnival in Brazil. I'm going to explain to you what this photograph is about and what what Carnival says about my cultural identity and being a Brazilian, etc. Okay, so that is the main points of your introduction. Now, in your body, these are things that you could talk about in your speech. You're not required to talk about all of these things in your speech or in this particular order, but I think these are some helpful points that you could talk about in your speech. A definition or your definition of culture. B, a description of the artifact, how it is used in the culture or represents the culture. I think this is important if you have an artifact that by just looking at it, people may not understand what it is or how it's used. C, a description of the culture or the artifact's culture. So you might show us the object, but what is it? What culture is it connected to? Is it connected to, being Black American? Is it connected to being Brazilian culture or Mexican culture? Okay, so describe a little bit of those cultural elements. D, why is this cultural artifact unique or special to you? So maybe this specific object has been passed down to generation. Maybe this object is, only one thing of a couple material possessions you have. Maybe it's a rarity. So maybe there's a nice story behind the object itself. And then finally, how being involved in the culture has impacted or changed your identity. Okay, so as I mentioned, feel free when you're organizing and preparing for your speech to play around with what order and what different subtopics you want to talk about with your cultural artifact speech. And then finally, you want to have a brief conclusion. You don't want to end with "that is all," but you just want to end with something that says, today I talked about this part of my culture, and I'm going to end with this quote that, culture is A, B, C, and D. Okay, so in 15 minutes, I've basically explained to you I've explained to you, let me see, making sure my face is big. Okay, so in 15 minutes, I basically have explained to you the cultural artifact speech and the cultural resume. Both assignments are equivalent to a midterm grade, and both